Environment Sketching Week 1, Perspective and Composition. Hi everyone, welcome to Week 1 of Environment Sketching. I'm your instructor, Dzu Nguyen, and for the next 8 weeks we'll be covering the principles and methods for designing and drawing environments. I'm a concept artist in the video game industry, and this is the same approach I use for my professional and personal work. The information also applies to students interested in illustration and animation visual development. The goals for this class are 1. To establish a solid iterative design process. 2. Develop your creativity and improve your storytelling. And 3. Gain confidence and speed. If you complete the assignments and put in the practice, the quality of your work will improve automatically. The first half of this class will focus on line drawings and the basic fundamentals. The second half of the class will introduce black and white speed painting as another approach for generating ideas. We will then focus on detailing and finishing a portfolio piece. This week we'll be reviewing perspective and then learning about some basic composition principles. Keep this information in mind and try to apply it to your homework as you sketch. Don't worry if you can't remember everything. The more you practice, the more it will become second nature to you. Let's start by talking about materials. In this class, I'll be using Photoshop and a Wacom tablet. If you feel more comfortable with another software program or traditional materials, then use whatever is comfortable for you. For your homework, submit everything as JPEGs with a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. The dimensions and aspect ratios of your sketches will change from week to week, but in general, you'll be compiling all your sketches onto 1 or 2 pages during the thumbnail phase, and then submitting your final drawings and paintings individually. This first lesson will be a review of basic perspective, followed by some fundamental composition principles. I'll start by creating some frames for each of my sketches. This is important because it's difficult to judge the composition if everything is so wide open and there aren't any boundaries. The frame also helps you to see size and shape relationships and the vantage point and viewing angle. If you're having trouble drawing a straight line in Photoshop, you have a couple options. The first option is to use the line tool. The hotkey for that is U. With the line tool, you can see a preview of the line before you actually draw it. And by holding Shift, I can draw a perfectly straight line and it will snap in the orientation that I want. The line tool can also be used to draw lines at different angles, not just vertical and horizontal. So it's actually very powerful. The next option is to just hold the Shift key while I'm drawing with the brush tool. You can see here that it also draws a very straight vertical and horizontal line, much like the line tool. You can also press and then hold Shift and press a second time to draw a line at different angles. So here I'm pressing and then holding Shift and then touching my pen down where I want that line to go. Notice that it's starting to taper here, and that's because I have shape dynamics turned on in the brush palette. If you switch that off, you'll be able to draw a thick line that's consistent all the way along its length. Try drawing some different sizes and shapes for your frames. Here's a vertical example. We could also try something that's a little bit more square. You could even go extremely wide. The idea is to try and challenge yourself to create a composition that fits inside one of these frames. Think of the frame as a window into the world that you're creating. The viewer is going to enter through your picture frame. Some common aspect ratios that you can try include film, HD TV, and also old television format. So for film, you could try 1.85 by 1. You could also try 2.35 for the length and a height of 1. For HD TV, it would be 16 by 9. And then for older format TV, standard TV, it would be 4:3. Recently, I've been doing most of my work at 16:9 because working in the game industry, most of the video game systems will be connected through HDMI to a high definition TV. That's not always the case, but I like the format. It's rectangular and it's very dynamic. Sometimes with a square composition or a 4:3 composition, it gets a little static and you don't get enough real estate on the sides to create really dynamic compositions. So if it were me and I had to stick with something, I would stick with a 16:9 or maybe a 1.85:1 aspect ratio. Everything else I think you can experiment with and it's a good exercise to do. But try with whatever you can think of, really. Sometimes I'll go really skinny. Sometimes I'll go really squat with my aspect ratios. Any of these will work for this particular exercise. Uh, to actually find an easy way to draw these aspect ratios, you could use the marquee tool. The hotkey for that is the letter M. So here you can see the marquee tool can create any size or shape, right? But if we actually want these specific aspect ratios, I'll switch back to see the toolbar up here. And what I'll select under style is go to fixed ratio. And then here you can see I've already entered 4 for the width and 3 for the height. So when I draw the aspect ratio now, it's always going to be that particular 4:3 ratio. Once I have that, I can right click on my pen or thumb click on my pen and then click stroke, select the width and the color. And then when I click OK, that gives me a frame, perfectly straight lines with that particular aspect ratio. We could do 2.35:1. So here you can see when I click and drag, it gives me that widescreen format. I'll right click or thumb click on my pen and then go to stroke. Again, leave the width at 10. You could change the color if you want to, but black is fine. And that gives me a widescreen format. We could do 1.85, so you can see the difference here. Again, just click and drag, click on the thumb button, stroke, 10 pixels is fine. So you can see the difference between 1.85:1, which is this bottom one, and then 2.35:1. And then finally, let's do 16:9. Again, just for a comparison between all three. So you can see that 16:9 is very close to the 1.85:1. Now that we have the setup explained, let's review some basic perspective. Perspective allows us to create the illusion of three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface, but it's still only a guide and tool. In the beginning, it's more important to generate a lot of sketches and ideas than it is to have accurate perspective in each sketch. Stay loose and just draw. You can always clean up the perspective later. In each of these frames, I'll draw a straight line called a horizon or eye line to determine the vantage point of the viewer. If it's high on the image, then this is called a bird's eye view, and the viewer is looking down on the scene. Things are a little more detached from this angle, and the viewer is more separated from the action. It can be used for establishing shots or to emphasize the smallness of things in the picture. If the horizon line is low, then this is called a worm's eye view, and we're looking up at most things in the scene. This is a little more immersive and can help make an object in your scene look taller or more powerful. Tilting the horizon line creates a Dutch angle shot, which is more dynamic but can also create a sense of discomfort or disorientation. This is a type of camera shot where the vertical and horizontal lines are rotated at an angle relative to the side of the frame. Choosing different aspect ratios for your frame and moving the horizon line around can change the overall feel of an image. When you're sketching, think about the mood and the emotion that you're trying to communicate and use the most appropriate aspect ratio and vantage point. If I draw the horizon line right here in the middle, notice how it evenly splits the vertical direction in half. This creates a very boring and static composition because what you're effectively saying is that neither one is important. They're equally the same. Whereas in some of these other compositions, you can see that I'm emphasizing either the sky or the ground. Generally speaking, I typically avoid the middle portion of the canvas. When I put my horizon lines in, I usually stay either 1/3 or 2/3. In these frames, I'll start drawing vanishing points on the horizon line to establish a perspective system for each picture. In linear perspective, all parallel lines converge to the same vanishing point. As things get farther away from the picture plane, they start to distort and appear smaller. In general, we'll be using 1, 2, and 3-point perspective systems for our environments. Notice how in 1-point perspective, the vertical and horizontal lines are straight, and there isn't any distortion in either of these directions. Only the lines going back into the picture are distorted and converge at the vanishing point. 1 point is good for showing depth and distance, and is the easiest of the perspective systems, but it's also more limited than the others. In 2-point perspective, only vertical lines are straight and undistorted. Parallel lines converge to the left and right vanishing points. This is more dynamic than 1-point perspective because you're starting to see objects rotated in space. It's also better for showing more form and dimension in your scene. Three-point perspective is like 2-point perspective, but there are no undistorted lines now. All the vertical lines now converge at a third vanishing point, either above or below the horizon line. If it's above, then we're looking up at the scene in a worm's eye view. If it's below, then we're looking down on the scene in a bird's eye view. Generally, the placement of the third vanishing point is used to reinforce the bird's eye or worm's eye. Try to stay loose in your construction. Don't get caught up in too much detail early on. Especially when it comes to perspective, it's very easy to become fixated on making everything look technically correct. Stay loose and let your imagination run wild. Later on, we can correct the perspective and go in and clean up all your lines. For right now, in the very beginning, just try to get your ideas out on the page. What I'm doing here is strengthening the reed on the cube itself. I'm going in with a darker blue line to make it stand out from the red construction. Later on, we'll do the same thing using different layers in Photoshop. Remember that this is an iterative process and that we go through the design in different stages. Don't worry about making every stage look perfect. Save that for the very last stage. The placement of the vanishing points will affect the amount of distortion in the object. The farther apart the vanishing points, the less the distortion. In example 1, the two vanishing points are really close to the edge of the canvas, causing the cube to become distorted. In example 2, the vanishing points have been pushed farther back, and the cube now looks more realistic. In 3-point perspective, placing the third vanishing point too close to the horizon line will also result in unnatural distortion. In example 3, the third vanishing point is close to the bottom of the canvas, causing the box to become distorted. To avoid this, I usually place the vanishing points at least 2 to 3 picture lengths apart. In the top left example, I've pushed all 3 vanishing points away from the edge of the canvas. The cube becomes less distorted the farther out that we push them back. Finally, some distortion will usually occur near the edges of the frame, so I tend to avoid placing anything really important near these areas. In the bottom right example, the black cube and the blue cube are close to the edge of the canvas, and therefore have more distortion. The red cube is near the center and has less distortion. The red cube is actually inside of our cone of vision. Keep these perspective tips in mind while you sketch. Experiment with the placement of the horizon line and vanishing points to see how the feeling and impact of the picture are affected. Now that we've reviewed perspective, let's dive into some composition principles and tie the two together.